Well, forgive me for vulgarly bringing the speech forward, but I've done this often enough to know that to stand between people and their pudding is probably better than to stand between people and their bed. So please don't feel shy of eating your pudding as I speak. And I promise the second great deliverable of an after-dinner speaker to be quite brief. What I can't promise is the other requirement of an after-dinner speaker to be sort of humorous and funny about Britain in Asia or the world. My jokes, I have to immediately declare, would be positively funereal, so I will resist them. But I want to start with the idea that the world is a world at the moment of three moods, at least. There is Asia, which is gloriously optimistic. I feel whenever I get off a plane into one of the great gateway cities of Asia, like Singapore, I feel like I felt the first time I flew to America. You know, Singapore reminds me of a bustling JFK and New York. The first time as a graduate student, I went to the United States. And why does Asia feel like that? Because it's living out that dream of kids being richer than their parents and the prospect that their kids will be richer than them. And so many American social scientists, going back to the 70s and 80s, declared that the social glue of America was that implicit social contract that parents saved and worked hard so their kids could be the first generation at university or at a better university than their parents went to and enjoy better incomes than they did. That dream has come crashing down in the United States, and hence, in many ways, this extraordinary mood we now find of an Asia, optimistic, convinced it can crack its problems, get its arms around them, deal with them, and I'll come back to those problems. A United States increasingly alarmed by the success of that Asia, but particularly of China. China, in many ways, the creation of, an American global market, liberal, rules-based economy from post-war onwards, which has created its greatest success. What greater, more flattering thing you can have than the emulation in many ways of Chinese capitalism for American capitalism? But today, as I'll come back to, there is an America which feels on the defensive, on its back foot, troubled at home by this breakdown of that social contract of continuous improvement between generations, and challenged abroad by the rise of China. And there is a third mood out there between Asian optimism and American pessimism, and that is European inwardism. A Europe which quite simply has lost the plot, Britain and continental Europe alike, and is consumed by its internal difficulties. And I can think of no way better, in a sense, of illustrating that than the recent annual Munich Security Conference, where I found myself on its last night sitting beside a Stanford professor who'd previously been an American ambassador to Moscow, and he turned to me in great puzzlement and he said, over the 3 days of this conference, I've not heard a single European refer to the threat of China. The only threat you're all consumed by is Brexit. And to Asians or Americans alike, this astonishing retreat from a strategic vision of what's going on in the world to an inward-looking European vision of our difficulties is striking. So whether you are the pessimists of America or the optimists of Asia, Europe seems to be bobbing along in the rear without any sense of the strategic competition between these two regions which is emerging. And, you see this in all the sort of social science research surveys, whether it is Freedom House with its global annual democracy surveys, or the Pew Research Center with its annual surveys of the status of, the economy and of democracy. In Europe, and indeed in North America, there is a high correlation between economic dissatisfaction and a frustration with the quality of your government. In Asia, in many places, some of that, or a few places, notably India, that economic dissatisfaction is shared. But it does not translate into the same dismay about your government. And this brings me to the, in a sense, first big point I want to make, which is that authoritarian government is not a peculiarity of North America and Europe today. It began in Asia. President Xi was always one in China, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, the list, Duterte in the Philippines. The list is long. But the origins of these governments is very, very different. It's less about economic failure, and it's more about what is the kind of directed government system that can deliver us long-term strategic thinking that is going to address the very fundamental problems we have to address if we're to keep our economic growth going. Whereas in the West, the rise of authoritarian governments is much more associated with economic failure and perceived decline. The Democrats are letting us down, or at least those middle-class liberal Democrats are letting us down. How can we look beyond that to find the kind of governments that will address our frustrations and disappointments, whether it is Trump in America or the Brexit issue here, or the government now in Italy, or many of those governments in Central Europe. But let me come back for a moment to Asia and its big issues. When you just list them, you see the scale of government demand, which, make our frustrations over HS2 or a third runway at Heathrow puts them in perspective. The massive rate of urbanization across Asia, the dramatic rise of a middle class, the impact of climate change and environmental deterioration on the public health of Asian cities, particularly in India and China and cities like Hong Kong as well. The astonishing challenges that they're facing around protecting their food chains as diets change and they move to a much more meat-based diet with a much greater demand in terms of food production that supports. A region which, because of its population growth, has a concentration of sort of water stress anywhere in the world. The general sort of crisis of government that comes out of this, which is less about democracy, but do we have governments which are addressing these problems? Are they accountable and effective in the ways that they are dealing with them? And what does it lead you to? A demand in Asia for long-term versus short-term government thinking, a demand, if you like, for strategic as against incremental solutions. And what does that equal? In many ways, the current China model. And you see across so much of Asia talk not of emulating anymore the British or the American democratic model, but of emulating the strategic discipline of setting goals and progressing towards them that China is thought to represent to many of them. And, as you move through these issues, so that you see, Asia a leader through China in artificial intelligence, a leader also in the whole set of cybersecurity issues, you see a region, which represents, after all, depending exactly what you count as Asia, half the world or even more, because I know there are many Middle Easterners here tonight who claim to be West Asians, as I've gathered. So if you sort of take the largest vision of Asia, this is, after all, the global epicenter demographically as well as in so many other ways. And then you add on top of all these governance challenges and development challenges that the region faces, the inevitable pressures towards conflict, whether it is what we've just seen in terms of the flare-up around Kashmir between India and Pakistan, or the Korean Peninsula, or the South China and East China Seas, as well as disputes as we move more westwards across the region. Now, this picture of opportunity and turbulence, of great ambition, of great strategic discipline about how to address these problems for a region which is growing demographically and economically at the same time, suddenly Britain wants back in. And that is half the theme of what I was asked to discuss tonight. A Britain which represents 2.5% today of global exports, 1% more in terms of global imports, but which, I know as a former Minister for Asia in the UK government, when I went to India or to Beijing, I was not treated as, the great returning hero. I was treated as one in a long European queue of ministers, supplicants for improved trade and investment relations. And you look, of course, as we've all heard during this Brexit debate, at who are Britain's top export partners. And other than China, which is right up there at the top as number 2 in terms of at least British imports, although it's 6th in terms of our exports, there is no other Asian country, despite their huge demographic size, in our top 10. It is still Europe, with more than 40% of our trade, that remains our dominant partner. And so whether it is suing for access to an India and China, which both, as I think many in this room can attest to, have their, let's put it this way, ambiguous, ambivalent historical memories of the relationship with the UK, which doesn't lead them to cut us instant favours. Our entry back into these markets is complicated, and the TPP, which President Obama had negotiated, has been cited by our own International Trade Secretary Liam Fox as one way back in, even though the Americans have left it, but the other 12 Asia-Pacific countries have remained in it. But fundamentally, the point I want to make tonight is, while there might be a way back to win a little bit of trade advantage here or there, although it seems to fly in the face of everything I've ever learned about international trade, which is the bigger you are, the better the deal you get from the other side. But assuming for a moment that rule and apparent law of gravity of international trade is suspended, Britain is a victim, I would argue, of very bad luck. When this Brexit thing began, it was possible to imagine that an international liberal rules-based trade regime was going to continue to prevail in the world. The worm had turned, but it had not so evidently turned as it now has. But now we've moved into a completely different world. We've moved into a world where US-China competition is going to define not just global politics and global security, but also global trade and economic opportunity. At the Eurasia Group, where I spend part of my time offering political risk advice, which is usually profoundly wrong in every way. So, and only good for after-dinner speeches of this kind. Let me just start by saying that we this year put U.S.-China relationship as our number 2 global risk. And it comes off the back of a resurgent China, and I say that in historical terms. I use the term referring to a China intent on returning to where it was several hundred years ago, but also a US which under President Trump has done no better job than under President Obama of really making the pivot to Asia, of which its diplomats like to talk. We are honouring tonight a great hero of Afghanistan, Francis Vendrell. It's not a happy story. There is bipartisan agreement now in Washington about the need to leave Afghanistan. It's not if, it's when and how. If you look at the issue of Pakistan-India, what was striking about the last crisis in Kashmir was the absence of both US and Europe and UN from the peace-broking role that all had played in the last crisis. If you look at the Korean Peninsula, in many ways, President Trump is a busted flush at this point. His bluff has been called. And then you look at an array of major American allies in the Asian region and the way they are not leaving the protection of the US, but, if you like, sort of rebooting, repositioning themselves in a much more balanced way between the US and China. And I cite just the Philippines, where President Duterte has had elections over the last day as an example of that. So there is a major recalibration going on in Asia. And, it's not a recalibration that China invited. It's one that I think China anticipated would arrive, but expected it to be 10 years down the road, not now. It is the US which has brought this on, and for reasons which, from a Washington perspective, make good sense. The idea that China was just going to be a sort of an ally in an American-led global market order because it was a market system which had so benefited China was, I think, always simplistic. And inevitably, China is starting to bump up against American sensitivities, and whether it is the competition over artificial intelligence, whether it is cybersecurity, where there is plenty of wrong, no doubt, on both sides, whether it is Belt and Road, with the dramatic level of Chinese investment. And just to give you a sense of that, the envelope of Belt and Road investments is something like $1 trillion. American global annual, and this is an apples and oranges kind of comparison, but nevertheless, American, annual foreign economic assistance is $35 billion. So it is increasingly outdwarfed by China. Or if you look at issues of their relative diplomatic efforts, whereas the American State Department is in some kind of meltdown with, in 2017 alone, 60% of its career ambassadors resigning because of the new Trump administration, with China now having the second largest diplomatic service in the world after the US, and growing its budget at twice the rate of its defense budget, at the same time that the US is proposes to cut its diplomatic budget 25% in its new Trump budget proposal. You can just see a dramatic shift accelerating. And if you look at Africa, a region I'm particularly engaged in, today on African economic initiatives, it seems, according to the Washington Post, that China fields 5-1 in terms of its diplomats engaged in Africa on those initiatives compared to the US. And if I then look at security, whether it's the issues I've mentioned, again, this is a time of great and growing conflict. And so, in many ways, the way we all look at the current trade dispute and the way that Trump has rather petulantly slapped tariffs on another round of Chinese goods, and there's been a quid pro quo by the Chinese. In a sense, it's a very 20th century dispute around soya and steel. The real issues of competition, AI and cybersecurity, where these two systems are starting to lock horns around very different ideological parameters. And, in Washington, this is not a Trump thing. Democrats are at least as angry about China as Trump is. It's an issue which was slow to burn up, but now it has become strongly bipartisan, astonishingly so in some ways. And at its core is an American perception of ideological difference, of a Chinese state-led investment model versus the American romantic image that all its technology advances are invented in a garage in Palo Alto by a Harvard dropout like Bill Gates or Zuckerberg. In truth, America's is a much more state-driven investment than they like to imagine through Defense Department budgets and others. But it's also a communal versus individual rights battle. I chair a very impressive group called the International Crisis Group, which looks at incipient crises, political crises and conflicts around the world. Our top China analyst is just completing 150 days in solitary confinement in China because he's Canadian and was arrested in a tit-for-tat for the Huawei order by the Canadians for her, the Huawei CFO based in Vancouver, for her potential deportation to the US under an international arrest warrant. So, China is showing a sharpness and hardness in its response to, in a sense, the US throwing down the gauntlet, which doesn't bode well for any of us. Now, I've dwelt on this rather than, if you like, on Britain and Brexit to make a bigger point. What chance Britain alone in this environment? There are two potential organizations of future politics out there at the moment. One is a US-China two-polar world. I doubt that it will degenerate to the Cold War level of the US-Soviet competition of the past, because there's too much common interest in mutual trade. We could never buy or sell anything to the Soviets, so it was always a security-based conflict. In the case of China, there is always going to be mutual trade and economic advantages between the US and China, which will always mean that it is not just a competitive, conflictive relationship, but at the same time a collaborative one. And it's how that is managed which will be critical to our collective futures and securities. But there is an alternative to that, and one which would have a much greater prospect of that management being successful. And that's a three-legged stool, where Europe steps up as the third leg to that stool, as a region which is, by history and culture and conviction to the freedom of individuals, on America's side, but lacking America's sort of trigger-happy, gung-ho approach to confronting China, seeking to find common ground between the two, the referee in this football match. But that Europe will not emerge if it is a divided Europe, of which Brexit is just one symptom. The government in Italy, what's happening in the Visegrad countries of Central Europe are other symptoms. What is happening with Marine Le Pen in France and the collapse of the traditional party structure there is a further symptom. The rise of the right in Germany, another one. So this is, Brexit is our peculiar pathology, but it is not unique. The question is, can Europe pull itself together, the current Brussels-based format or another? And to believe that this can just be done through NATO is, in my view, a great mistake, because this new, if you like, global geopolitics that I've described is going to be about economics and technology and cybersecurity as much as it is about the warheads we confront each other with. It needs a Europe-based partnership. Without it, we're already seeing the signs and the price of what happens, which is a Huawei, which is peeling off Central European countries to buy its 5G, even dividing the Western European countries, which already has signed up 33 African countries to Huawei 5G. A Belt and Road Initiative, which already enjoys the control of the Piraeus port in Athens and has now secured the Trieste port in Italy. Europe risks being balkanized in this new competition between the US and China. And the idea that Britain has the frivolous luxury of going it alone as a couple of percent of the global GDP in the midst of this is a strange and dangerous aberration, a whim of, if you like, a piece of colonial DNA that we somehow have not shaken out of ourselves. We belong in a Europe, and a Europe in turn, which is willing to engage in managing this very, very dangerous new global competition that has emerged, and managing to secure a healthy collaboration, even if there is conflict at the edges between the US and China, rather than allowing it to deteriorate into a bipolar world, reminding many of us of our childhoods with all the dangers and the sort of bomb shelters down the garden that I think we may not remember here, but certainly many of my American friends remember. So there's a lot at stake here, and I hope we all, as champions of Asia, as much for Asia as for ourselves here in Britain, commit to trying to secure a happy, if you like, global governance of this emerging order. Thank you very much.
Lord Malloch-Brown has very kindly agreed to field a question or two. So if we have any questions from... Right. We have a hand at the back.
Shall I speak loud? Or
that is fine. I think the room is small enough.
Britain is the fifth largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
If you count Europe as a single economy, then it is the fourth largest economy in the world. Are you saying it is therefore insignificant?
Is that the question? Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, the fifth between 2.5 and 15% is quite a jump, and so this is one of those league tables where the first division stops at 4, and you're a good second division power at 2.5%.
I wonder if I could ask you about China's influence in Europe. If you look at the number of MEPs who represent countries that have signed up to Belt and Road projects across Europe, whether that's through the Euro 16+1 or through Italy or Poland or all of the other various projects that are already in operation, including Düsseldorf actually and Germany, 40% of Europeans the European Parliament's MEPs post-Brexit come from countries that have already taken the Chinese shilling.
Could you speak up?
Sorry, I was just saying that after Brexit, 40% of the MEPs in Europe come from countries who have already taken the Chinese renminbi for the BRI project. What impact do you think that is going to have on Europe?
Should I take that? Huge. And the point is, left unaddressed, it is going to divide Europe. I mean, it is perfectly reasonable for many European countries to take both the American dollar and the renminbi. You know, these need not be exclusive choices. But it needs a politically strong Europe to manage these investment and trade flows in a way that does not divide Europe. And at the moment, it is dividing Europe. And I just do want to be clear, you know, what I've said is not intended as some sort of simplistic, you know, Europe's a great place, Britain shouldn't be leaving it. Europe is a deeply challenged place, which risks fundamental division. And Britain staying in Europe is not about staying in a comfortable club, it's about rescuing a failing club. And, you know, I want to be clear about that. It's, you know, that you cannot have the situation that was just mentioned of 40% of Europe, or at least its MEPs, you know, with strong sort of Chinese political control and influence via their investments, and just sort of take that line down. Because if you do, Europe just becomes, you know, a kind of strange, sort of divided battlefield between the two primary strategic economic powers. Because, you know, the point I'm trying to make here is the age we all lived our careers out of a liberal market economy where politics was secondary to, you know, where investment opportunity lay, is gone. We now live in a highly politicized global economy where politics trumps economics, and you sort of lay down your political defenses at your peril.
The implication of what you're saying is that social democracy is dead, is that right?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's got to reinvent itself. I think, you know, to the extent that it just simply fails to produce answers for significant portions of British or French people, the supporters of Gilets jaunes, or, you know, other things here in the UK, show it's failing. And, you know, but the answer is, in my profound belief, non-authoritarianism. It's a much more responsive, listening democracy which kind of gets out of London and goes, you know, solves people's problems, whether it is through more decentralization, you know, whether it is through, you know, all sorts of both economic policies and, you know, improved listening as a political class. But, you know, I had the privilege of having dinner quite recently with President Macron in France, and, you know, his sense that there had been accumulated failure of his predecessors to address a growing frustration in France amongst, you know, a growing disenfranchised group, at least as they saw them, you know, I think is you know, very, very clear. And, you know, strangely, he's a supporter of Brexit here, not because he believes in it, but because he thinks he's seen in France too many times when the French elite has ignored the opinion of the majority and just got on with it. And he cited to me the example of the 2005 referendum in France, which voted against the new European constitution, and then the French establishment promptly signed up to it 2 years later. So I don't think this is, you know, this isn't a straightforward issue. It's not a pro or anti-Brexit issue. It's about, you know, a authentic politics where people believe that those who govern them are listening to them and accountable to them and responding to their problems. And our politics is as broken as it gets.
I think maybe at that point we might spare our speakers strained vocal cords. Just to finally thank you on behalf of the Society for a very stimulating and very broad-reaching talk this evening. I think it's good to hear if we are going to mention Brexit, to hear it mentioned in a much broader context than we normally hear it mentioned in, which is one of, unfortunately, a very narrow party political debate. So on behalf of the Society and guests, thank you again.